Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on Are We There Yet? The 21st Century Neighborhood. I'm Jeannette Dubinin, Director of Resilience and Adaptation at the Center for Planning Excellence, and we're in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Some of you might be sitting in your living room or kitchen, and I really appreciate you tuning in. For those who may not know CPEX, we are a nonprofit planning organization that works across Louisiana to advance our mission of bringing people, culture, and planning together to make great communities happen. We work with state and local governments, communities and neighborhoods, and philanthropic and nonprofit partners to help communities adapt to climate change through planning and foster diverse community engagement in plans and planning processes so that we have equitable outcomes that enhance everyone's quality of life and resilience. Over the past several years, we have been increasing our focus on how the built environment, which in many places is largely the result of poor planning decisions and regulations or lacking of them, intersects with climate change, public health, and equity. We believe that through thoughtful planning and intentional community planning, we can address many of the issues that have been exacerbated in recent months, such as deep inequities in our vulnerability to disasters and climate change. As the coronavirus pandemic has been spreading, we're seeing even more ways how community design impacts a person's ability to stay healthy and manage closures and economic disruptions while keeping the lights on and food on the table. What's become very clear to me is that we need redundancies in our community design so that we can all thrive when we're well and be resilient when there's a crisis, no matter the type. Unfortunately, the redundancies I'm talking about are lacking in many of our communities and are often intentional, which is how you might know about food deserts, for example. To address these issues, we started talking about complete neighborhoods, places where people can afford quality housing, have access to transit, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, parks and green spaces, grocery stores, healthcare providers, and basically connect to these types of daily or weekly destinations within a reasonable time. This isn't a new concept by any means, and actually the place I grew up in, Germany, has provided me with lots of fodder on what a complete community is. Older towns and cities were designed that way because people had to walk and bike to their destinations. In the 20th century, the car enabled us to easily leave our neighborhood, and it seemingly made everything more accessible. But in reality, it actually fragmented how we lived and where we worked and played, and our dependency on the car increased. So as we're 20 years into the 21st century and have some perspective on how the 20th century planning decisions have impacted our cities and towns, we want to kick off our discussion on what our hopes are for the 21st century neighborhoods. So I'm really excited to introduce our guest speakers, Emilie Bahr, Tyson, and Victor Dover, who are all experts in their different lens on what makes a complete neighborhood. Each of our speakers have a long list of professional achievements, and so I'm really grateful to have them with us today. In the interest of time, I'm going to provide a short introduction to Emilie, Chris, and Victor. Emilie is a writer, urban planner, and walking and biking evangelist based in New Orleans. She heads up the walking advocacy training program, The Walking College on Behalf of America Walks, and is the author of the 2016 book, Urban Revolutions, A Woman Guide to Two-Wheeled Transportation. She's happiest when she's outside, running, walking, biking, or paddling with her husband and young children. Chris Tyson is the president and CEO of Bahr and is responsible for directing day-to-day operations, as well as developing and implementing Bahr's short and long-term strategy and plans. He also serves as a direct liaison to the Baton Rouge Board of Directors and communicates on behalf of the authority to other key stakeholders, including the City of Baton Rouge, East Baton Rouge Parish Mayor President. He's a Baton Rouge native and holds a Bachelor of Architecture with honors from Howard University, a Master's of Public Policy from Harvard Kennedy School, and a Juris Doctor degree from the Georgetown University Law Center. He's a Newman Trowbridge Distinguished Professor of Law at the Paul M. Herbert Law Center at Louisiana State University, and practiced as a real estate and land use attorney, a management consultant, and a member of U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu's Washington, D.C. legislative staff. Wow, I really botched that Louisiana pronunciation of Bahr. Sorry about that. Victor Dover is an urban designer and co-author of the book Street Design, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns. For 33 years, Victor has been designing walkable, sustainable development and really knows how to plan our neighborhoods and shape enduring cities that people love. In Louisiana, he's led the design for projects in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Jean Lafitte. a small town in Jefferson Parish. Victor is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Miami and a fellow both to the American Institute of Certified Planners and the Congress for New Urbanism. He serves as vice president of the Parks Foundation of Miami-Dade, and he's also a board member of the National Recreation and Parks Association. So before I let them talk, I want to make a couple housekeeping points. We are recording today's conversation. CPEX will make it available on our website and YouTube channel. The participants' mics and video will be off. And we do want to hear from you. So we have some time reserved at the end of the webinar for the question and answer section. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat in the Zoom meeting. Okay, let's get started with Victor.
Well, thank you, Jeannette. I'm really excited to be part of this. I think it's a conversation we need to have 20 years into the 21st century. I'm going to share my screen. I will point out that my virtual background here is also meant to inspire you just a little bit, because that's a picture of the Maryville Bikeway in Charleston, South Carolina. It's my hope that the next generation of communities in America and the gradual rehabilitation and renovation of the communities we've already started on this continent will be a greener one, that will have communities that are greener in the indirect sense, or the not literal sense, that they're configured in a way that's mindful of an earth-friendly approach to life, but also that they'll be greener in the literal sense, that there'll be more verdant. And so that's the reason for the Maryville Bikeway. Now, in order to do that, we've got to see if it's possible to disrupt or accelerate the disruption already underway, that relationship between individual adult Americans and their private motor vehicles and all those single occupant trips. So I've been thinking a lot about what the future of a car optional neighborhood might look like. Chances are it will probably not look like the forgettable shopping center or a dead shopping mall that we all have one or several of in our metropolitan regions, and look more like a village that's walkable and compact, the kind of place where you actually like it so much you're there just because you like being there, as opposed to there because you have to be there for work or for home. You know, in our office, a lot of the people who work in our firm in the inner ring suburbs in greater Miami managed to get to work without bringing several thousand pounds of fiberglass and steel and rubber and petroleum with them by showing up on two wheels or on 2 feet or via transit. Others do drive. We don't have parking, so they park several blocks away if they want to look for an affordable parking space. And still others carpool. So the effect of having our office in this little traditional historical building without a lot of room on the lot for a parking lot has actually been to change behaviors. And that got us thinking about what the future might look like. In the new executive parking lot in our office, the best parking spaces you can get are the ones right next to the conference room door or outside our desks. Years ago, we designed a neighborhood in Atlanta called Glenwood Park, and it has what for the time seemed a pretty revolutionary component, which is live-work units, where that you see in the background of this picture, where the downstairs is a home for small business, an expanded space for home-based businesses. And it varies, you know, it could be the lawyer who got tired of working in a high-rise in Midtown and decided to put their small office underneath their home. You know, it could be the piano teacher who has a narrower and more modest building, but teaches lessons downstairs to the kids in the neighborhood in the afternoon and lives upstairs. But that kind of zero commute housing option, which just sounds more like the traditional historical blend that human beings have been experimenting with for 5,000 years in the history of city building, doesn't have to have a fancy name like live-work units or transit-oriented development, because in the not too recent past, all development was transit-oriented development, and all development was walkable development. Now, where can we change the environment we already have to embody some of those principles? There are lots of different locations, including the graying out and dying off shopping centers and shopping malls, which have outlived their useful life, have seen a pretty cataclysmic economic disruption for the 10 years prior to the last 3 months when that got even worse. So I think we're actually going to see some of those spaces changed into the live-work combinations, which will still have retailing. Unlike the dead Kmart seen in the middle of this picture, they'll probably have smaller and more locally serving businesses. Again, implementing the idea of shortening car trips. So these are trends that were already underway and things that are being incorporated in smart growth and new urbanist developments for 25 years. There's some specific reasons why I think the next generation of these are going to be pretty important. First of all, cost. It's just such a burden to households to make it a requirement for every person over age 16 to be issued their own car and to make long trips driving alone for every basic daily need. And we now have lots of documentation to support the idea that if you can live close to transit, you can spend less money. And then the earth-friendly part of that is we now also understand that people who live in cities and towns have a much smaller carbon footprint than those who live in the outlying suburbs. This is a emerging view from Hank Dittmar from a few years ago that shows how much lower the carbon footprints of those who live close in Chicago and in the inner ring historical suburbs is than those who live in the outlying areas. And so we get this idea that if you live in a more compact place, you can probably have less impact on your environment. And that would be a good thing, considering we're trying to get our house in order as a planet to deal with global warming, global climate instability, and sea level rise. So, okay, it follows. If you live more densely, you can support transit, and there's less driving, and your carbon footprint is smaller. There are a couple of other things that are not so obvious. One is that if the design of the town is more like a web and less like a tree, that is more of an interconnected network of streets and a grid or a modified grid, whatever it might be. There is also less driving that happens, and this has been carefully documented now. Places that have smaller blocks not only facilitate easier walking and biking, but they also make it possible to shorten your trips and reduce your vehicle miles traveled. And then here's another one that's surprising. Local serving storefronts, when they provide options to people in neighborhoods where they make short trips instead of long ones, or even replace a trip with walking and biking, and transit also lowers vehicle miles traveled and makes your carbon footprint fall off a cliff once you have enough choices closer at hand, suggesting that the 21st century car optional neighborhood will probably have some of those features: more density, more of mix of housing types, more intersections, that is smaller blocks, and more mix of uses close at hand. So let's take a look at Dover's hastily prepared 10-part recipe, the ingredients for a car optional neighborhood in the 21st century. I'm going to talk about each of these. This is the cheat sheet, and I'll bring it back up again at the end. First, we need to look at recycling the land that we've inherited that no longer is being used for the purpose that it was used before, and do that in a way that deliberately, principle number one, brings things closer together. Lets mixed use be practical and does that in town, closer to the center of the region where there's transit, infrastructure, and all the other things you need in daily life. And as we bring things closer together, fold in livable density in the form of missing middle housing types, more than just the tall apartment complexes and skyscrapers and the short single family houses, but all those other building types in between, like the row houses seen here, duplexes, small apartment buildings, courtyard apartments, and the like. Number two, we need slow, safe, highly walkable, and bikeable streets. That probably means all ages and abilities have the ability to move around. We have to rebuild our streets anyway. As we do so, we need to make them tree-lined and shaded and comfortable and safe for people to move around walking and biking. Number three, here's that web, more like a web and less like a tree. You see this pattern that I'm showing you in this example has small blocks like in a traditional city. And that's not just European. You also see small interconnected blocks in places like Annapolis and Alexandria and Savannah and Portland and Key West, and on and on and on. It's very much an American tradition prior to the Second World War. If we do that, we make it possible for people to get around. And then when we're doing it in redevelopment sites, we can make the block and street pattern hook up to its surroundings, which has further benefits. Number four, when we build buildings, we have to make sure that it's street-oriented architecture. And then we have to face great tree-lined green streets and green public spaces that are comfortable and generous. So when people are living in higher density, they can still have a healthy life. They can have views across open space and even long vistas, and they can get fresh air and sunshine without necessarily feeling like they have to live in their own little house on the prairie to do that. So the street-oriented architecture component is hugely important. And that basically means no blank walls. It means doors and windows facing the street, porches, storefronts, balconies, the things that make the front of a building face our streets and public spaces. If we don't do that, people won't walk, and then they'll carry out that self-fulfilling prophecy that Americans won't walk anymore. Number 5, 2 parts. Number 1 of that, part A, plant trees, especially street trees. And then part B, plant more street trees, more than you think. Because if we use the streets that way they should be used, we'll be both greening the city and making it more functional. Number 6, to connect to our surroundings with high quality bike infrastructure. In the foreground of this, you can see the trail that's part of the riverfront in Chattanooga, and this neighborhood is designed to hook up to that. Number 7, there's all sorts of new technology, and there will be even more new technology we can't guess about yet. But that includes Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing, pickup and drop-off services, bike share, scooters, car share. Nowadays, you can have car share services at the scale of the individual building. So your building could have a tiny fleet of a handful of cars that are electric and charging downstairs, used only when you need it, booked on the app on your phone, without necessarily being part of a citywide network. About electric vehicles, autonomous and connected vehicles, lots of people talk about that. But we won't just have autonomous vehicles to drive us around or to move our freight. We'll also have small-scale delivery robots. And who knows what's next? So the answer here is be open-minded about optimizing for new mobility. Could include those small electric circulators. It could include the apps on your phone. It could include the revival of the moped, now in electric form. And of course, it can include autonomous circulators that help us make the short distance trips and deliveries in the right size vehicles. Now, optimizing for new mobility also means rethinking parking. So just a quick segue here, I've taken you up into the air, looking down over Atlanta. Gabe Klein has recently predicted that with autonomous and connected vehicles, the demand for urban parking spaces will drop by 85%. Okay, well, there's lots of predictions. What if he's only half right? That will be a huge change. And how do I know? Because if you look out the hotel room window at Atlanta, what you realize is that a huge amount of the land is actually being used for parking. If you look out the door at Austin, you'll see the same thing. If you look out the door in Miami, or you look off the transit station, you'll realize that the transit-oriented development is actually parking-oriented development. So the goal in the future has to be to right size the parking, have just enough, not too much. Why? Because it's incredibly expensive to provide all that parking that we're using so seldom. And so the small blocks with parking tucked in and under and around, but not dominating the scene, is the nature of the city of the future. Number 9, if you're gonna have people bike to work and they might not come from the neighborhood itself, you need to plan for showers in the workplace. Easiest points you could ever earn in green building rating systems. Go ahead and get showers and covered bike parking at your workplaces. And number 10, we need to design those neighborhoods around a transit-connected mobility hub, or more than one, so that we link the region, which is the economic unit, and the neighborhood, which is your unit for daily life. And that simply means a place to move between one system or one mode and another. That when you get off the transit system, you're at the center of community life, and you can quickly switch to walking or biking or transit or using a scooter or whatever is appropriate. And that is 10 things I think you can look for in the car optional neighborhood of the near future. Jeannette?
Thank you so much, Victor. We're going to go to our next guest speaker. Emilie?
Yeah, let me see if I can share my screen. Sorry, guys. Suddenly, oh, here we go. Let's see. Why am I not seeing share screen? Here we go. Okay. Is that working? Can everybody see that?
We are not right now.
You what?
We're not, we're seeing you.
Huh, okay. It says I'm sharing. Let's see, let me do escape. Share.
There we go.
Okay, do you see that? Lessons
Yes.
from New Orleans?
Yes.
All right, great.
Yes, perfect.
All right, well, thanks so much, Victor and Jeannette. Taking things over from Victor, I'm going to talk a little bit about a very specific set of circumstances in New Orleans and sort of what I think they say about some of the cultural obstacles to achieving significant changes to the status quo, and also why I have a lot of hope for the future. So this is my house. It is a lovely little place built in the 1920s. And when my husband and I bought it, it had a tree growing through the back. It was about a foot out of level, and you worried walking through it that you'd fall through the floor. But we bought it nevertheless because we really loved the neighborhood. And now we love this house too, although we're actually in the process of selling it and moving down the street to a much older house, also in need of serious repair. Because as I think is probably true of a lot of people right now, these past few months of spending almost all our time at home with 2 adults working and 2 small children out of school has everyone in my family distinctly aware of the advantages and the deficiencies of our house, specifically the need for a bit more room. But one thing we definitely have not outgrown is our neighborhood. If anything, this time has highlighted to us the virtues of our neighborhood, which are many of the same things that appealed to us as a young married couple and that make my 68-year-old neighbor promise she's never leaving except on a stretcher. So I live in New Orleans in the Faubourg St. John neighborhood, which is near City Park and Bayou St. John. It's a place where I can go to 3 different grocery stores on foot. I can walk to see a movie. I can go to dinner, meet a friend for drinks. I can walk my kids to several playgrounds, though we're not going to them much lately. I can hang out in some of the best public spaces imaginable, and most years I can hear the music of Jazz Fest from my back porch. I live in a neighborhood where on any given Sunday until a few months ago, I'd hear the thump of some bass drums and run outside with my kids to find the second line coming down Broad Street with thousands of people falling into step behind. Until a few months ago, I walked my daughter to her daycare. A few weeks ago, I got into my car and I realized I hadn't been in it for over a month. And I found myself thinking a lot lately about how similar my family's current existence is to the way our ancestors lived up until about 100 years ago, around the time my house was built. They lived in close-knit communities where they weren't required to travel great distances to get what they needed. And I've also thought about how many people don't have this option, the great luxury that it really is to be able to get just about anything you need without a car. And conversely, about an imaginary single mother living in some far-flung suburb in a depressing apartment where she has to put her kids into a car to get anywhere her family needs to go. The isolation of this experience that is so contrasted with my own, as I've been sharing physically distanced toast with my neighbors on Wednesday evenings from our front porches, ordering takeout from restaurants with a 5-minute walk away, and staying relatively happily put. I'm going to try to hold it together for this slide, but I also live in a neighborhood where Mardi Gras before last, a drunk driver going more than 80 miles an hour plowed into a group of cyclists riding in the bike lane on one of the main streets that runs a block away from my house. 2 of my friends were among the cyclists hit that night, and they fortunately recovered, but they lost 2 of their best friends that day. A couple of ghost bike commemorations notwithstanding, virtually nothing has changed there more than a year later, despite ample opportunities to make infrastructure and policy change. This in a city where car ownership is well below the national average, poverty is rampant, as are related health problems, and we, like Victor in Miami, are on the front lines of the effects of climate change. As everybody here probably knows, New Orleans, and especially our predominantly Black population, has been disproportionately and tragically hit hard by the effects of COVID. And in the wake of the pandemic and the surge in people walking, biking, and otherwise using public space outside of cars and the pronounced decline in automobile traffic, I've been involved in an effort to make a historic stretch in my neighborhood into a so-called slow street, giving more of a priority to people in recognition of the way the street is increasingly being used. Moss Street is a wide 2-lane road along a historic waterway in a mostly residential area that has seen a lot more use by all modes in recent years. Since COVID, it's become even more popular for people walking, running, biking, as people seek out any opportunity to get outside and get some fresh air, see other people, and exercise in a physically distanced way. So the city rolled out this pilot initiative, slowing car traffic and elevating pedestrians and bicyclists a bit. And the result was that on any evening, you could walk out as the sun was setting and find people of all ages and abilities gathered on the bayou, walking and biking around, exchanging hellos. It was really nothing less than idyllic. And then 2 weeks later, the barricades came down and everything went back to normal after our city councilman gave in to what I would say was a vocal minority in opposition, explaining that he couldn't support a project like this without a robust public involvement process. I have nothing against robust public involvement processes, but it's funny to me that you rarely hear statements like that about projects that are not involving making space for more people. This experience has been a really important reminder about the extent to which we've internalized our car-centric biases. While this project had overwhelming public support, among the unlikely folks coming out in opposition, as gleaned in part from my brief toe dip into the murky waters that is my neighborhood next door forum, were a guy who ran for mayor on the Green Party ticket, the head of a local historic preservation organization, and a retiree so concerned about the feared inconvenience posed by an increase in traffic on the side of the bayou that didn't receive this slow streets treatment because neighbors on that side have historically opposed any sort of intervention like this. She sat on her porch for days counting cars in order to cast doubt upon the city's official findings. The official survey and study, by the way, found that the initiative was successful by just about every measure and that the traffic increase had been minimal. I think that the deeply embedded nature of car culture in our society is perhaps the most difficult obstacle to overcome in bringing about meaningful change. When you work with walkability advocates for your day job, it's easy to forget that many people don't see things through your lens. So as Jeannette mentioned, I head up a program on behalf of America Walks called the Walking College, which is a 5-year-old initiative that seeks to empower grassroots advocates to make change in their communities. Fellows undergo a 6-month online training program that teaches them things like the basics of walkable design and policy and strategies for effective community engagement. The past 3 years that I've been involved with the program, we've seen record-breaking demand each year and an increasingly strong and experientially and professionally diverse crop of candidates. And while those of us working to create more vibrant, equitable, sustainable, livable places face significant obstacles in achieving our goals, I find numerous reasons for optimism, a few of which I'll briefly share. For one thing, we've got a tremendous opportunity right now to reimagine our streets. Between demand for space to engage in physically distanced exercise, increasing concern about climate change, awareness of the inadequacy of our infrastructure, particularly in some of our poorest communities, and the reckoning we as active transportation advocates and people generally are confronting about the disparate ways that people are treated moving about the public sphere based on race, people are demanding change, and I think that policymakers increasingly are going to have to listen. For another, there's the well-documented shift underway for some time in which younger and older people increasingly want car-light lifestyles. And finally, while culture is generally seen as a tough thing to crack, our behavior and thinking can be moved in relatively swift fashion, as I think current events make clear. I think about the outcry that occurred 100 years ago when the car was first introduced to the city, and to the dramatic reversal in thinking that allowed us to get into the situation we now face, and also to the COVID-related decline in auto trips and surge in people walking and biking, how bike shops are running out of inventory, how the world is catching on to the fact that many people don't need to go into an office every day to get good work done, and to the people taking to the streets to call attention to the need for a reckoning around racial injustice and the role the built environment plays in perpetuating inequities. People are being introduced to a new way of living and thinking about the public realm, and the more people we see out walking and biking and demanding change in the public rights of way, the more likely others are to consider following suit. To that end, I'll just share quickly a couple of brief anecdotes. So I'm a lifelong runner and active person who cares strongly about environmental and social justice issues, and yet it was a little more than a decade ago, and I'm almost 40, that it first occurred to me to use the bike that was collecting dust in my cramped apartment to go anywhere. And once I started using my bike in this way, a whole new world opened up to me. My father-in-law, meantime, is a man in his late 60s who was born and raised in a small town in North Louisiana where he still lives. In his town, the F-150 pickup truck could just as easily be the town mascot as the Peach, and which it is officially. And from his house, which is this beautiful tree-covered spread right off a highway, there's nothing to walk to but a strip mall without anything terribly compelling to offer. And it involves carefully navigating the gravel-strewn shoulder of an interstate to get there by foot. And yet, as automobile-centric as my father-in-law's everyday life is, when he comes to my house, he parks his pickup truck, pulls down the electric bikes he and my mother-in-law now bring with them whenever they come to town, and he doesn't get back in his truck until he leaves town. And he gets super excited about showing visitors around this way too. So I started with a cute picture of my house, and I'll close on one of my son, Hudson, because another reason for optimism I find in my kids. My son is 4 years old now and already an inveterate cyclist and scooter aficionado, and his 2-year-old sister is following not far behind. He's also an advocate in the making. He scoffs when he sees drivers get too close to the bike lanes or not stopping at crosswalks, and I occasionally overhear him lecturing his grandparents about the need to reduce their use of fossil fuels. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jeannette.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Yeah, the new generation is definitely someone we need to speak to and hope to influence in that way too. So Chris is up next, and he brings it to Baton Rouge, and I'm very excited to hear from him.
All right, thank you, Jeannette. Okay, so I think we need to end the screen share. Emilie, I'm sorry. Okay, great. So let's try that again. Okay. And I will share. I think let me get, okay, good. Well, thank you all again for having me, CPEX and everyone who's listening. It's good to be with you. Chris Tyson with Build Baton Rouge, based here in Baton Rouge. We are the city's redevelopment authority, and as such, our mission is to bring people and resources together to promote equitable investment, innovative development, and thriving communities across all of Baton Rouge. I want to speak to you today in line with our topic about the Imagine Plank Road Plan for Equitable Development. It is a neighborhood-focused planning effort that we've been conducting for the last 2 years and are still implementing, and I want to talk about that in the context of complete neighborhoods and creating walkable and safe neighborhoods, particularly in the context of our city's disinvested neighborhoods, as we have in Baton Rouge and as we have around the country. Much of our discussion around complete neighborhoods has kind of reflected the rise in new urbanist thinking, traditional neighborhood developments that have sprung up around the country, a return to more traditional living, and all of that is good, but all of it has had a decidedly upscale bent. And what we've seen is particularly highlighted in the social movements that are unfolding before us right now, is a profound spatial inequality in American cities that mostly impacts poor Black and brown neighborhoods. And so we want to think about, what does a complete neighborhood mean across the inequality divide? What we know is that poor neighborhoods have mostly always been walkable, and they've always had local economies. They've always had people who rely predominantly on walking and biking or mass transit to navigate the city, and that has always been there. But we don't always conceive of poor communities, particularly poor Black and brown communities, when we think about or when we imagine what we want the city to become and how we want to transform space in service of these broader ecological, social goals. And so we have to understand that the way that our cities are, particularly the way that our poor minority neighborhoods are the result of very specific policies, very specific politics, and maldistributions of resources that have left these neighborhoods without basic infrastructure, without the amenities that exist in other parts of the city, and largely isolated and marginalized, such that they are outside of our conception of kind of what the future city is to become. Here in Baton Rouge, we're the capital city for Louisiana, and we have considerable racial and spatial stratification. And the neighborhoods of North Baton Rouge are overwhelmingly Black, they're overwhelmingly poor, and they are where we spend a lot of our focus here at Build Baton Rouge, thinking about how do we address the disinvestment so that they can truly become complete neighborhoods. And so I want to, in this conversation, just think a little bit about what does a complete neighborhood look like within the context of a poor Black community and a city that wrestles with a legacy of racial and spatial stratification. The Plank Road Master Plan that we developed is all of the things you see on the screen, right? It's a process, it's a vision, and it's an implementable roadmap for equitable development. And I'll refer to that as I go through these quick slides, just to give you some context of how through this project, we saw an opportunity to implement a complete neighborhood in the context of very specific demographic and social and historical factors. Plank Road began as the working class neighborhoods for the white workforce of the Standard Oil plant. And Standard Oil is the forerunner to Exxon. Exxon has in Baton Rouge the 12th largest oil refinery in the world and the 6th largest in the United States. And when they came to Baton Rouge in 1909, it literally transformed the city overnight. And Plank Road began developing in the 19-teens and 20s into a vibrant commercial corridor that, again, was for the white working class workers of the plant who were a mile away. This is an image from the 30s, and it gives you an idea of buildings built to the street. Obviously, this is a much smaller Baton Rouge, so it still has a rural character to it, but this is still largely the character of the land use today, but it is profoundly vacant. It is profoundly disinvested. It is blighted. The infrastructure is missing. Here, this is emblematic of the character of the street infrastructure along Plank Road. As I will share with you in a second, Plank Road has the highest concentration of zero-car households in the city parish. So most of the time when we talk about what does a carless neighborhood look like, or what does it mean to promote walkability, when we close our eyes and think about that, we're not thinking about desperately poor Black neighborhoods, because they're usually outside of the scope of what we think about as being part of the city to begin with. This is what our city's most walkable neighborhood by dint of the population of people who are actually lack car access and ownership. This is what it looks like, and you can see it is lacking considerably. Buildings built to the street, they're largely blighted. We have a food desert here. We have significant blight. Obviously, with that comes crime and a number of other issues. Plank Road today is the neighborhoods along Plank Road are more than 90% Black. They are more than a third under the official poverty line. And while there are incredible businesses and people who live here and conduct their lives every day and they thrive, the city has neglected this community, as it has communities like it all around the country. And so again, we want to think about what does a complete neighborhood mean for the isolated, vacant, blighted, and neglected neighborhoods that exist in many of our cities around the country. Now, our vision is to have a thriving, socially diverse, walkable network of neighborhoods anchored by local businesses, quality housing, and resilient infrastructure. Again, we recognize that many of the preconditions for this to happen already exist, but we want to repair what has been done through years of neglect and marginalization. Our process was community-led. We had significant public involvement, both through our community events and our steering committee. We had a number of reports generated, and I just give a snapshot here just to emphasize that when we think about transforming neighborhoods like those of the Plank Road corridor, it has to be community-led. Part of the issue with how these neighborhoods came to be is because of deliberate neglect. And so we have to repair that in the bonds of trust through an equitable process that is community-led. It is also transit-oriented. The Plank Road corridor will feature Louisiana's first bus rapid transit system, and it will flow from the northernmost part of Plank Road down to where the jobs are in downtown and South Baton Rouge to the LSU campus. That is tremendous. Again, this is the highest concentration of zero-car households in the city parish. It is the second highest used transit line in the city's transit system. And so moving people who go to work every day and giving them infrastructure was important. And bus rapid transit through federal grants, which Baton Rouge has secured, gives us the financial leverage to do so much more along the public right-of-way. And that sets the preconditions for addressing the blight and the dysfunction, making sure that we have ADA compliant intersections, which are lacking today, making sure that we have room for pedestrians and bicycles. That is important, and so this is a transit-oriented plan. Out of the community process, we arrived at 5 themes: preserving community and culture, attracting and growing Black-owned businesses, tackling blight and vacancy, introducing more quality shopping, providing accessible and attractive places to gather. I want to emphasize that the focus of this plan, it's great if we achieve all of these things and other people from around the city or moving to Baton Rouge want to locate on Plank Road and live there. But the priority, the people who we centered, are the people and the businesses living there now. And that is so important because usually when we conceive of what a traditional neighborhood development is, or what a new urbanist take on an old part of the city is, we don't have the policies or even the intentionality to prevent the displacement that usually pushes indigenous residents out of their community. As we kind of prioritize affluence, attraction, and upscaling without an attention to inequality and equity. Our strategies, I'll go through these pretty fast, but again, a complete neighborhood has to have a complete process. And so we wanted to be sure that we were thinking about not just the physical space, not just economic development, not just the needs of the community, but thinking about all of those things at the same time, so that we're thinking about community development, economic development, land development as a way to achieve spatial transformation, spatial equity, and to ensure that we have a high quality of place, but also address the needs of the community. We're thinking here about home ownership and repair assistance. Build Baton Rouge operates the city's land bank. We also are looking at community land trusts through a hybrid community land trust land bank model that will address home ownership, but also will address affordability for neighborhood businesses through cooperative ownership structures. This is important because as things inevitably upscale when you invest in neighborhoods, you have to ensure that on the front end you've taken the policy steps to protect indigenous residents and businesses so that they have the ability to remain as those neighborhoods upscale. We also are looking at an overlay district to ensure that we take the existing kind of built to the street spatial dynamics and protect those and make sure that we get similar development so that as my other colleagues here have expressed, we have neighborhoods that are built at a scale and are ordered in a way that facilitate walking, facilitate local business development and patronage, and give people a range of options for moving around. A cultural district. We have a lot of dilapidated historic buildings here, and so we wanted to ensure that we have the financial mechanisms we need to bring those buildings back to create an authentic quality of place that recognizes the past but also connects to the present. The small business programs are huge. Minority businesses, Black-owned businesses invariably employ people from the neighborhood. They employ other Black people. They employ other people who live close by. And so creating that local economy can't just be a talking point. We have to be very intentional about it, understanding that the structures and processes and systems that disinvested in those neighborhoods and those businesses were equally intentional. And so equity has to involve a very specific focus on making sure that resources are channeled in a specific way to address these issues. Returning blighted properties, the thing that most people recognize when they move down a corridor like Plank Road or through those neighborhoods is the dilapidation, is the blight, is the vacancy. And so we wanted to think about that intentionally and how we can restore, restore buildings and structures in a way that invites residents and businesses to exist and thrive, and also that creates attractive streetscapes for pedestrians and bicyclists and transit riders and others to enjoy. And then we had some talk about tax increment financing that would make all of this feasible. But by and large, I want to emphasize that our plan for Plank Road and our thinking around a complete neighborhood was race conscious. It is informed by history. It is equity focused, and it is community centered. And that is the only way that I think we can pursue complete neighborhoods, not just for those of us who have the resources to live wherever we want and have multiple modes of transportation, but those who only have the option to walk, who only have the places where they live, which have long been neglected and which deserve the same consideration and attention and intentionality that the rest of the city has long received. So with that, I'll look forward to the discussion, and thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your amazing work and the passion you bring to it. And I know we don't have much time left, but I do have a question that maybe some of our attendees can also get information from on how to engage in the future. But my question is, how did we get to where we are now? And we know that it's not right, but how did we get to these disinvested areas, the car-centric? What decisions were made or not made, and how do we change that so that we can have better neighborhoods, complete neighborhoods in the future? And if we can also talk a little bit about how those that are not in the planning profession could be involved, that I think we could all make change in the future together.
I just got finished talking, so I didn't want to go first, but I'm happy to. Jeannette, it's an important conversation, and I say this all the time whenever I speak. I think we live in cities and we assume that the way that we live is pre-political, is natural, and is just inevitable, right? That I just have to get on the interstate every day and drive miles and miles, and that those people on the other side of the town are there because they got what they deserve, right? And that's how we think of the city, unfortunately. And so I think we're in a period where we're all being pushed to think beyond those strictures and reimagine the city, both in terms of how land use is ordered to accommodate multiple modes of mobility, and also how we acknowledge the history of disinvestment, of racial segregation, that again was intentional and deliberate. There's an extensive policy history, and we are now in a period of an explosion of writing about this. Books like The Color of Law, articles like those that Ta-Nehisi Coates has written on the case for reparations, and others which detail the very specific policy lineage that gives us the spatial inequality, if you will, and stratification that we have in cities today. Baton Rouge is largely developed in its present form in the 20th century, which means it develops largely after the rise of the automobile and the codification of Jim Crow. And that is mapped onto all of our challenges in this city, and so many other cities are just like that. So I think we have to wrestle with that history and also shake ourselves out of the notion that any of this is pre-political, natural, or inevitable.
Wow, yes.
Can I take a crack at it? I agree with everything Krista said. I think it was very deliberate, and you can trace back that history and you can see how during the physical implementation and the codification of the American apartheid period, it was done on purpose. There's no question about it. And race and class were motivators. I do think that we have to look back also and see what consumer choices were made. And people basically don't make real estate decisions in many cases, in fact, often don't make their political choices about whom to vote for based on facts and data nearly as often as we might like to pretend. They do so out of emotion and based on desire and instinct. And the instincts were manipulated in an incredibly effective, if insidious, campaign. Well in advance of, but especially in the time of the Great Depression in 1939 World's Fair, the General Motors Futurama on Wheels exhibit that basically said the past is done and the future is going to be on four wheels for everybody, and it's going to be great. You're going to have 2 Ford Freedom. And they sold this idea. They sold it hard. And it was a hard sell, actually. It took decades to convince large numbers of people that they should abandon traditional ways of life and try to live behind the wheel all the time. And so that included effective propaganda and marketing campaigns and the invention of jaywalking as an idea. And the people behind those decisions were people that were thinking what's good for General Motors is good for America. They were wrong. And they were thinking that we should buy more Firestone tires and spend more money on gas from Standard Oil, because if we drive more, it'll somehow get cheaper by the mile. And that was the propaganda message. We bought it, and it was actually convenient in a lot of ways, because some people, like Roosevelt's brain trusters in the New Deal, looked at it and said, well, maybe this is the way we can get the economy going again, get people consuming all those things, not just the new houses out in sprawl and consuming the land, but consuming new appliances and consuming new cars. And if they consume enough, we can employ enough people. And that was a strategy that they used. They turned industrial designers, propagandists, and advertising experts on selling that vision to Americans. Second, it was looked on by people after the Second World War at the threat of atomic attack as an opportunity to justify dispersing the population, which, by the way, would also help quell labor unrest, which was on purpose, and institute Jim Crow into redlined areas and flow investment into new subdivisions for homogenous populations living alone. And that was insidious. And then the same group came and saw, wait a minute, if we're implementing all this highway thinking, we can smash right through the neighborhoods that are most vulnerable and have the least clout with these big highways and say we had to do it, the car made us do it, when in fact what they were doing was trying to decimate and separate and divide communities that were once whole. So we did it to ourselves. We didn't do it because there was any evidence at all that it would be a good idea. It was done because it was sold to us.
Right.
I agree with everything that was just said. And, I think there's a great book by Peter Norton called Fighting Traffic about that propaganda effort to introduce cars to cities. And I think it was hinted at by the other two, but, white flight after integration of schools is a huge driving factor in all of this as well. Made possible thanks to the highways and the cars that were introduced.
And I would just add, Jeannette, that to agree with everything that has been said, and to also just center policy as being very critical here. I have 3 kids right now. I used to live in the Garden District in Baton Rouge. My wife began splitting time between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. We moved to the edge of town in a one-way in, one-way out neighborhood. It's a beautiful place, but I have a commute now. We're trying to get back in the city like you, Emilie. We have our house for sale, so we can move back now that our work patterns have changed. And so a host of policies have kind of limited our options, so that when we had to reconcile, working between 2 cities, there was no other option to live in Baton Rouge and make my wife's commute workable because of all of the narrow kind of constrained choices that have been given to us. And so and people are making choices within this broader policy and economic framework that we have to be conscious of and deliberate about changing.
Great, yes. So we had a question from the audience that ties in really nicely. The question was, how did you engage the residents in the Plank Road effort? But I think that speaks to a larger question of how can non-planners and people in the community participate in making those changes that we all know we need to make to have complete communities.
The first thing we wanted, yes, I'm sorry.
No.
The first thing that we wanted to prioritize was actually spending money on local businesses. Oftentimes planning efforts, we hire professional planners, we kind of come in, and that's a good thing. We want professional planners to be involved, and a lot of money gets spent, none of it with local businesses who are local, residents who may have micro businesses and things of that nature. So we were excited to spend money with local businesses. That was part of the engagement, but also to do a lot of activity-based and kind of experientially based activities on Plank Road. We were there. We were in vacant lots. We were taking people up and through areas that they otherwise would probably not have gone without being chaperoned or for some event. And we wanted people to be in the space. And we wanted people to experience with other community residents the fullness of their humanity, right? The legitimacy of their demands from their city to spend their tax dollars in their neighborhoods, right? And how all of us, whether we live in the neighborhoods of Plank Road or never ever visit there, have a linked fate with what is going on, right? If we are part of the city, then we are part of all of it. And we rise and fall based on the condition of all of it. So we were very deliberate about making those connections, and our community engagement team here with other local people in the community. We had a community ambassadors team who was involved as well. That was how we did a lot of that. And you can see all of this if you go to, if you hashtag Imagine Plank Road on any of the social channels, you'll see a number of media that we created around a lot of those events. Hashtag Imagine Plank Road.
Yes. Anyone else? Okay, well, we have 3 minutes left. If there are any more questions or thoughts, we can discuss them now. If not, I would love for you guys to give us 1 or 2 sentences about what you want the audience to take away from this discussion today. So maybe Emilie?
Trying to figure out which computer I'm working from. Yeah, I think one thing that strikes me from our conversation is just the intersectionality of so many of the issues that we're talking about. And I think a lot of the problems that we're also talking about come from treating any of these in isolation and thinking, okay, we're going to fix this one thing, but not taking any account of the racial implications, let's say. And I think that that is something that fortunately we are coming to terms with a bit better, I think, now than we have in the past, and I hope that we do so moving forward.
Victor?
Well, I would just add that you don't get the city that you want from just sitting around hoping for it. It doesn't come from Santa Claus or from the Easter Bunny or, magically appear out of nowhere. It's not going to just sprout on its own. You get the city that you want from deciding, from drawing lines on a map, from designing it, saying, let's do it this way, not that way. And the more hands that touch that plan, the more you can involve the people that will be directly affected by that, the better. So my suggestion is, remember that we can decide what we want our communities to be when they grow up. That's the benefit of planning. And it pays huge dividends if we get the people who will be living with the results to touch that decision-making process at every possible point.
Jeannette, I would actually like to close by mentioning something I didn't get a chance to mention, and I think it's something that I know Victor touched on specifically. I believe, I don't have a crystal ball, I'm not a futurist by any measure, but I think the next decade will be defined by the changes in automation and climate change. And that is going to have, I think, considerable impacts on how we think about urban design and how these issues of spatial inequality and places that we want to see transformed are actually transformed. We will be doing that work as there are significant changes happening with our climate and with the way that technology impacts our lives. And so I think it's important as we think about this stuff, and it's in everything that we do here at Baton Rouge. We are aware that you know, 10 years from now, we're going to look back, I think, and find that this was a significant decade and that a lot of changes that are going to impact how we live in cities are about to take form. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And this concludes our time. There were a couple of questions in the chat that we would be happy to answer offline. But for now, thank you so much for tuning in, and happy 4th of July weekend to everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.